I've been lurking around this site for a while, so I figured it was time to share my own story. It's a bit long, and it's still unfolding, as it involves an ongoing custody battle for my buddy's daughter. Since things are still in court, I'll keep the details vague so I don't end up making things worse for myself. For privacy's sake, I'm going to use fake names and leave out certain bits to stay anonymous. This story centers around my old best friend and business partner, along with his wife. He and I are still friends, but we're not as tight as we used to be. This whole situation shook both of our lives, so I feel like I'm in a decent position to tell it. Some of you might think I'm the villain here, but try walking a mile in my shoes before jumping to conclusions. Maybe you'll get it, maybe you won't. Either way, I'm not looking for approval. Let's call my friend Mike. We grew up together on the East Coast. He's always been a good guy, quiet, a bit of a nerd, and super smart. We've always had different personalities, but we clicked. We're the same age and used to game together all the time. Back in high school, I was more into sports and joined the Marines right after graduation. Mike wanted to sign up too, but his dad shut that down because of the mess going on in Iraq and Afghanistan at the time. His dad was fiercely anti-war. Not saying his dad was wrong, since a bunch of my buddies lost their lives out there. Mike might have been one of them. But, in a way, it didn't matter because Mike's life took a hard left anyway. He's serving a 25-year sentence now, all thanks to a woman. I can't help but think, maybe I could have changed things. Maybe I should have stopped him from diving headfirst into that relationship. When he first mentioned he was seeing someone, I was nearing the end of my military service, and I didn't push back. I regret that now. After 8 years in the Marines, I finally came home, honorably discharged. Most of those years were spent overseas. A few days after I got back, I called Mike, trying to set up a time to grab a beer. Mike had been hard to reach for a while, always busy with work, and he'd already turned me down once. We used to catch up whenever I came home on leave, but over time, we drifted apart. Now, Mike's running his own tech company, and not joining the military worked out big time for him. He got a degree in engineering, and within 4 years, built $1 million business. Meanwhile, I was starting over, no job and no real skills that paid well in the civilian world. I wasn't shocked by Mike's success. He's always been the smart one. That night, I was hoping to convince him to hire me at his company. We talked about me joining him once I was out of the Marines. I figured I could help with client relations and sourcing parts overseas. Mike had been making a lot of trips to Asia to find suppliers for components his company was designing, and I thought I could lend a hand. We had talked about this plan years ago. I showed up early at the bar, hoping he wouldn't bail this time. His car pulled up just as I parked. He'd done well for himself, driving a sleek luxury car that screamed success. I was pumped to see him, even though it had been 2 years, and I noticed he'd put on some weight since the last time we met. We exchanged some small talk as we headed inside. Now, Mike isn't exactly the bar-hopping type. That's more my thing, something I picked up during my time in the military. We got settled, and I tried to steer the conversation toward the job we discussed, but Mike kept dodging it. Instead, he was more interested in talking about his wife, whom he'd met while traveling in Thailand. He brought her back to the States on a spousal visa. I had heard about her over the phone when he first moved her over here. Apparently, they met 2 years ago when Mike was overseas, sourcing parts for his company. She'd been his translator and fixer, and eventually, they hit it off. Mike hired her as part of his business team, and after about a year, she moved to the U.S. She now handles all the company's international sourcing and distribution, and they co-own the business. After they got married in a small ceremony abroad, she began pushing for a big, traditional wedding in the U.S. It was her childhood dream, or something like that. Mike's always had a tough time with women, falling hard for any girl who shows him the slightest bit of attention. I've warned him before that it never ends well, so I tried to throw in a word of caution this time too. It seemed like she was getting way too much control over his business, way too fast. And then he told me something that really raised a red flag. They still hadn't slept together because she was holding out for the big wedding. She claimed it was important to wait for their special night. To me, that sounded like nonsense. After everything Mike had done for her, I found it pretty fishy. I asked him why they hadn't gone through with the wedding yet, and he said her family was having trouble with visas but would resolve it soon. That didn't sit right with me. I told him straight up, if it were me, things would have progressed already. Mike got a bit defensive, saying she was different, smart, hardworking, and beautiful. I tried to warn him again about giving her so much control over his life and business. I pointed out that plenty of women are smart and beautiful, but that didn't make her special. And the whole no-sex thing after all this time? That's a big red flag in my book. By the end of the conversation, Mike was clearly annoyed with me. I knew I had overstepped. When I tried to bring the job up again, I could feel that I'd already pushed him too far. He seemed distant, not the same guy I used to know. Maybe money had changed him, or maybe it was her. Either way, our meeting ended on a weird note. He said he'd think about it and get back to me, but I walked away feeling like the Mike I grew up with was gone, replaced by someone wrapped up in business and a woman I didn't trust. I decided that if Mike offered me a position, I'd just play the game. I'd say what he wanted to hear and be the agreeable employee he needed. I had to look out for myself. About 3 days after our meeting, he gave me a call and invited me to his place. I treated it like an interview. I was nervous, knowing how much was riding on this. It felt odd, meeting someone who used to be my best friend, but now I was hoping he could be my boss. I didn't want to mess up or say the wrong thing. I knew people change over time, and Mike was no exception. I wasn't sure if I'd meet his wife that night since they lived together, but I was mentally prepared for anything. I pulled up to his house around 9 or 10 p.m. He lived in a nice, quiet neighborhood. Nothing over the top, but definitely out of my reach at the time. Meanwhile, I was still crashing at my parents' place and driving a beat-up old car, so Mike's lifestyle felt worlds apart from mine. When I got inside, his wife was there to greet me. She seemed shy and a bit formal, but maybe that's what Mike liked about her. She was stunning, though, and had prepared a lovely meal with some Asian dishes for dinner. After we ate, the three of us moved to the living room with some wine and started talking business. Long story short, Mike offered me the position of VP of Customer Relations and Sourcing. I'd be overseeing 2 employees and be the third most important person in the company, right after his wife, Mia. I found out more about the company that night, too. It had around 10 employees at the time, and they specialized in manufacturing medical devices and parts for other industries. The way the business worked was clever. They designed the parts, get them manufactured in Southeast Asia, and assemble them back in the U.S. If you had a good engineering team and held the patents, you were set, because the customers needed those parts for life, and you could control the market. I started to realize that Mia was much more involved in the business than I had initially thought. She handled supply chain logistics, customer relations, marketing, and even some hiring decisions. Mike, as president, focused more on engineering, quality control, and securing patents. My role would be more about supporting Mia than Mike at first. Mia spoke decent English, though she had a noticeable accent, and she was incredibly sharp for her age, just 25, only a couple of years younger than us. Mike mentioned they were accelerating my hiring process because they were planning a trip to Vietnam and China soon, and he wanted me to go instead of him. Mia traveled to Asia every couple of months to meet with suppliers, and Mike thought it would be a great opportunity for me to step into that role as their business was expanding. During the meeting, we loosened up with a few more glasses of wine. As the evening went on, I noticed that Mia was letting her guard down a little. I started to see glimpses of a more outgoing side to her, something that didn't quite match the quiet, reserved personality she showed around Mike. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I realized she might have been putting on an act in front of him. Not that I was about to mention anything. I knew Mike didn't want to hear a bad word about her. A week later, I officially started the job. I had my own office and began my training. 2 weeks after that, there was a big medical expo in Las Vegas. A lot of our clients from the healthcare industry were attending, so it was a prime chance to showcase our company. Mike, Mia, another guy from our team, and I flew out for the 3-day event. We rented a modest booth, and I was lucky to be part of the trip. It gave me a real chance to dive deeper into the business and see how Mia handled client interactions. We flew in on a Tuesday evening and stayed in the same hotel. I didn't think I'd get much time to explore Vegas, given all the work I had to prepare for, but after reviewing some materials, I had a few questions. So, I headed up to Mike and Mia's suite to get some clarity. When I got there, Mike told me Mia had gone downstairs to take a break, and he was busy working on some design blueprints. Since my questions were more about Mia's side of the business, Mike couldn't really help me. After leaving their suite, I decided to head down and see if Mia was around. Mike wasn't the type to hang out in bars unless there was a real reason, like business or catching up with old friends, so I figured she might be handling some work. When I got to the casino area, I saw Mia at the bar, talking to some guy. She waved me over the moment she saw me, which felt a little off. When I joined them, they were suddenly asking for my opinion on a horse race. I didn't know anything about horse racing, and it seemed like they were just trying to distract me from whatever was going on. The whole scene felt weird, like Mia had been caught in the middle of something she wasn't supposed to be doing. I didn't think much of her talking to another guy at the bar initially. We were there for business, after all, and she might have been networking. But the way she reacted gave off a strange vibe, as if she was covering up something. They were drinking, and it looked like they'd been flirting before I walked in. When I joined them, the guy quickly made an exit, looking disappointed, like he had been hoping for more. Mia tried to play it cool, pretending like the horse race was what they'd been talking about, but I could tell something wasn't right. I didn't push it, though. Instead, I started asking her the questions I had about the business. Mia was more relaxed now, maybe because of the drinks. She was opening up more than usual, being much more social than the shy, reserved person I'd seen before. It was clear there was a side to her that she kept hidden when Mike was around. I managed to get Mia talking, and the conversation naturally drifted to her relationship with Mike. To my surprise, she had nothing positive to say about him. She complained that he was obsessed with work, extremely critical of everything, and had rigid views on how people should behave. I didn't add much to the conversation. I had already learned my lesson not to get between them. Instead, I just nodded along and agreed with whatever she said. The last thing I wanted was to stir up any trouble. That's when I got to know more about Mia's background. She was an only child, raised in a traditional home in China with strict parents. However, she had an uncle who was well off and gave her access to better schools and even took her on trips to the U.S. during her teenage years. She finished college early and landed a job as a business liaison between Chinese and foreign companies, which is how she met Mike. We talked for over an hour, getting to know each other better. The bar was quiet. Most people were either at the casino or doing their own thing. It felt easy, like there was some chemistry between us, probably amplified by the alcohol. Feeling a bit of the tension building up, I suggested we call Mike to join us, but Mia quickly dismissed the idea. She said he was already asleep and that hanging out late wasn't his style. She wasn't wrong. This kind of scene was never Mike's thing. As soon as I asked about him, though, the mood shifted, and I could feel the awkwardness creeping in. Realizing I had pushed the wrong button, I excused myself to go to the bathroom. Honestly, I needed a break. The tension in the air was palpable, and I was starting to think inappropriate thoughts. It wasn't like Mia was openly hitting on me, but there was definitely some subtle flirting going on between us. Maybe I was more to blame for initiating it, but the drinks weren't helping either. I knew I had to step back before I crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Mike was not only my friend but also my boss now, and I didn't want to risk my job or betray him like that. After freshening up in the bathroom, I returned to the bar and saw another guy chatting Mia up. He left as soon as I sat back down, clearly not too happy about it. It didn't take long for me to understand why she drew so much attention. Mia was stunning, easily a 9 or 10. I caught myself staring, and she noticed. All I could do was make a lame comment about how bad the music was and joked about dancing to it, which was ironic because it was a slow, boring track. She laughed and played along, even though the music was terrible. I asked her what kind of music she actually liked, and she said she was into R&B, EDM, and house music. I made another joke about checking out some clubs in Vegas that played that kind of music, not really expecting her to take me seriously. But to my surprise, she knew the clubs and told me exactly which ones were worth visiting, like she had been there before. When I asked how she knew, she mentioned she had visited Vegas a few times, including for a friend's birthday. She'd also been here for work trips. That's when I started to realize that Mia wasn't the person she pretended to be around Mike. She seemed to live a more carefree, social life when he wasn't around, which made me wonder just how much she was keeping from him. At that moment, I felt bad for Mike. He had been completely smitten by her, and yet, it felt like Mia was playing him, using him to further her own ambitions. She wasn't the sweet, innocent woman Mike believed she was. Instead, she came across as a savvy, manipulative person who knew exactly how to work people, especially men who weren't her husband. She kept criticizing Mike, saying she could do better and deserved more, which made me feel like she was building her own empire, with Mike as her stepping stone. I let her lead the way, and we ended up at a club that played EDM and house music. The line to get in was long, so we stood there chatting and flirting while we waited. We were both tipsy, caught up in the moment. Once we made it inside, we hit the dance floor, and things escalated quickly. Our bodies were pressed together, moving in sync, and it felt more like we were doing something way more intimate than just dancing. At one point, I got carried away and had my fingers inside her while we danced. She stopped me, reminding me that we should head back before Mike noticed she was gone. When I checked my watch, I realized it was already past 1 a.m., and she was right. We had an early morning ahead of us, with the booth at the expo needing to be set up before the crowd arrived. We left the club and grabbed a cab back to the hotel. I slipped the guy in charge of the taxi line a 20 to skip the wait. On the short ride back, Mia and I were in the back seat, and before I knew it, she was undoing my zipper and giving me a BJ. The driver didn't seem to care, though he made a joke about getting a room when we were just a few blocks away from the hotel. That snapped Mia out of it, and she stopped. When we got to the hotel, we took the elevator to our floor. I assumed she was going to follow me to my room to finish what she started, but instead, she just smiled, said goodnight, and walked off to the room she shared with Mike. I stayed up that night, feeling conflicted and wondering what could have happened if she hadn't left. The next morning, I was jolted awake by a knock on the door. It was one of my coworkers, reminding me that we were supposed to pack up and head down to set up our booth. It was already past 7 a.m., and we were running late. I scrambled to get ready, brushed my teeth, and hurried downstairs. I wasn't even thinking about the night before until I spotted Mike and Mia having breakfast downstairs. I had no idea how Mia would react when she saw me, but she greeted me like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. My coworker and I didn't have time to join them since we had to head over to the expo to start setting up. Once we got there, we unpacked and arranged our booth for the day. A few early attendees and potential clients stopped by, keeping me busy before Mike and Mia arrived. As the day went on, I couldn't help but sneak a glance at Mia every now and then, but she never made eye contact or spoke to me. It was painfully awkward, and I started to regret what had happened. I figured the alcohol had clouded her judgment, leading her to make a mistake, and I had taken advantage of that. By the time the expo was wrapping up for the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that she might confess everything to Mike, leaving me in serious trouble. She was clearly avoiding me, and I worried she'd tell him about our night. The thought of losing my job and friendship with Mike haunted me. To make matters worse, Mia left the expo early, and Mike told me she wasn't feeling well. I couldn't help but think her sudden departure had something to do with me. As I rode back to the hotel in the cab with Mike, guilt weighed heavily on my mind. I kept wondering if I should come clean and tell Mike what had happened to get ahead of the situation, but it seemed impossible to explain how things escalated between me and his wife. So, I kept my mouth shut and spent the rest of the day consumed by thoughts of Mia, not just in a sexual way, but also out of fear that she'd spill everything and ruin my life. That evening, I felt like I needed to talk to her. My job was on the line, and I couldn't wait another day to clear the air. I went down to the hotel bar, hoping to find her there like the previous night, but she wasn't around. It ended up being a long, restless night. The next day at the expo, things were pretty routine until Mike left to meet a client, and the other coworker was also out. It was just Mia and me alone at the booth, and no visitors were around. It was the perfect moment to talk, but I had no idea how to even begin. I awkwardly called out to her, trying to get the words out, but I kept stumbling over my sentences. She stared at me, waiting for me to say something, and I could tell from her expression that she was thinking, "What's wrong with this guy?" Finally, I blurted out an apology for what had happened the other night. She gave me a calm, indifferent look and simply said, "I know. It won't happen again." Then she turned away, going back to her work like nothing had ever happened. Her response was so cold and detached that it left me both relieved and confused. I had expected more, but she treated it like it was all in the past and not worth dwelling on. The tension between us broke when a potential customer walked into our booth, asking questions about the products. After that brief moment, I felt somewhat better. Mia's indifferent reaction made me think she had no intention of bringing it up with Mike, and I felt like I had dodged a bullet. That night, I returned to the hotel feeling much better than before and managed to get a decent night's sleep. The following day was the last one at the expo, and it was only a half day, with some meetings lined up with prospective clients. My coworker and I spent most of our time arranging for our products to be shipped back home. Mike and Mia dropped by the booth a few times, but most of their day was filled with private meetings. Oddly enough, Mia and I had a few normal conversations throughout the day. No awkwardness, no tension. It was like the incident 2 nights ago had never even happened. After the expo ended, the 4 of us shared an Uber ride back to the airport. I sat in the front seat, while Mike, Mia, and the other employee were in the back, chatting and laughing. Glancing at them through the rearview mirror, I felt an immense sense of relief. It seemed like I had managed to escape the situation unscathed, and I was grateful that things hadn't spiraled out of control with Mia. A while later, the trip to China that Mike had planned got postponed, though I can't recall why. Around that time, Mike and Mia were also preparing for the big white wedding Mia had always wanted. Her parents had already flown in from China, and most of the company's employees were at the wedding as well. By this point, my relationship with Mike had shifted to a more formal boss-employee dynamic. We weren't hanging out much outside of work anymore, but I was making more money than I ever thought possible, and things were looking up for me financially. In fact, I was projecting that my income would double within the next year, based on the company's growth. Around that time, we also hired 6 new employees, bringing our staff count up to about 30, including me, 2 other managers, and the engineering team. The company was thriving. Not long after the wedding, Mia and I began preparing for a business trip to China. She was planning to introduce me to new suppliers and help source components for our upcoming product launch. I couldn't shake the feeling that something might happen during the trip, considering our business class seats were next to each other, and we'd be staying at the same hotel. We had plans to visit 2 cities for business, and after that, Mia was going to visit her family in Western China before heading back to the U.S. Everything in my life seemed to be going great. I was making enough money to put a down payment on a house, and I even had a serious girlfriend at the time. Despite my lingering attraction to Mia, I was hoping nothing would happen between us. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I'd be able to resist if she made a move. During the flight, we mostly talked about business, with a few friendly conversations thrown in. Nothing inappropriate. However, there was one moment that stuck with me. Mia asked me, "Do you think I'm a good leader?" She followed it up with, "Would you come with me if I ever decided to start my own company?" I told her, of course, though in the back of my mind, I found the question strange. Why would she want to branch out on her own? She was already a major partner in Mike's company, and they had just gotten married. They didn't seem to have any issues, so her question didn't make much sense to me at the time. It wouldn't be until years later that it finally clicked. The rest of the week went smoothly. We spent a couple of days in one city and another day in a different city, staying in the same hotel but keeping everything strictly professional. Mia left to visit her family before heading back, and I returned to the States, feeling relieved that things hadn't escalated. I didn't bother going out to explore or sightsee during my time in China. That kind of thing was never really my style. I spent most of my free time on the phone with clients back in the US, or working on my laptop to make sure everything at home was running smoothly. After a week overseas, I felt more confident in my role. I had begun to see myself as a true international businessman, even though I had no formal training in product marketing or any qualifications for it. I owed all of it to Mike for giving me the chance to prove myself. Once the trip to China was behind us, I knew the fling with Mia was just that, a brief, regrettable moment. I was relieved it never went any further, and after that, we maintained a strictly professional relationship. A few months later, I proposed to my girlfriend, and we were married soon after. Financially, things were going great, and after about a year with the company, I was earning nearly $120,000. During the same period, Mia got pregnant, and 9 months later, she gave birth to a baby girl. Coincidentally, my wife also gave birth around the same time. Since we were all around the same age and got married close to each other, our daughters ended up being the same age as well. Mike and Mia tried to include my wife and me in everything they did, wanting us to be close friends. My wife was all for it, but I kept things strictly professional. I didn't want to blur the lines between work and personal life, especially given my past with Mia. I also couldn't shake the weird feeling I had about Mike and Mia's marriage, how she seemed to have so much control over him. I didn't want to get caught up in their dynamic, and I definitely didn't want my wife finding out about the past. My goal was to avoid anything that could put my job, marriage, or life at risk. Fast forward 2 years, and business was booming. I was now making about $400,000 annually, and my wife and I were expecting our second child. One night, Mike called me out of the blue, suggesting we grab a drink at a bar. It caught me off guard because we hadn't hung out like that in a long time, and Mike wasn't the kind of guy to suggest bar outings unless it was for business or something serious. He wasn't much of a drinker, so I instantly felt uneasy. I couldn't help but wonder if this was about what had happened between me and Mia years ago. Heading to the bar, I was a nervous wreck, thinking the worst, that maybe Mike had found out about the affair and was going to confront me. But then again, I knew Mike well enough to realize he'd probably fire me over the phone if he knew, rather than meet face to face. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe this was his way of handling things differently. When I got there, it wasn't what I expected at all. Instead of bringing up the past, Mike started unloading about the problems he'd been having at home. His relationship with Mia was falling apart. He had been dealing with some serious family issues and just needed someone to talk to. As he vented, I realized we hadn't spent much time together outside of work in recent years. He told me that Mia had been trying to distance him from his friends and isolate him, which explained why we hadn't hung out in so long. He admitted that their marriage had been struggling, and it only got worse with all the traveling they both did. Things took a turn for the worse when Mia's parents, who had come to visit for their wedding 2 years ago, decided to stay. Now they were trying to control how their granddaughter was being raised, which was causing friction between Mike and Mia. He told me he was struggling to raise his daughter in a multicultural household, especially with her parents living there, constantly undermining him. They didn't listen to him and were essentially isolating him in his own home. As Mike opened up, I could tell he had been carrying this weight for a long time. He probably didn't have anyone else he could talk to, and although we weren't as close as we once were, I was still the closest person he had. I felt bad for him. This was the same guy I had warned years ago about Mia and her overbearing personality, and now he was living it. I was angry on his behalf, but I didn't want to push too hard. I wanted to tell him to stand his ground and kick his in-laws out, but I knew Mike wasn't that kind of guy. Instead, I asked him how Mia felt about her parents staying so long and taking over. He told me that Mia was completely on board with her parents staying. She supported them being there, claiming that their influence made her the woman she is today. She had even said that since both she and Mike traveled frequently for business, her parents were the only stable force in their daughter's life. When Mike said that, I couldn't argue with her logic. It made sense, given their constant travel schedule, but I knew there was more to the story. I pressed him a bit further, and he admitted that he and Mia hadn't been intimate in over 4 months. When they weren't on business trips, she always had an excuse to avoid being close to him, whether it was work stress or their daughter needing her attention. He had even tried convincing her to step back from work and stay home with their daughter, but Mia was too ambitious for that. Mike just wanted a simpler life, with more kids and a wife who would be home to raise the family. They had more money than they knew what to do with, but Mia still seemed to crave more control over the business. I asked Mike if he had ever thought about divorce. It would allow him to share custody of his daughter and have more control over her upbringing, without the interference of Mia's parents. Plus, he could protect his finances, since whoever files for divorce first often has the upper hand. Mike looked surprised and said he hadn't considered talking to a lawyer or filing for divorce. Instead, he wanted to try marriage counseling first. I didn't discourage him from giving counseling a shot, but I did tell him it was important to have a backup plan. I also suggested he be more cautious and keep an eye on Mia's movements. I even recommended he monitor her phone, track her whereabouts, and install a GPS in her car. The look Mike gave me was one of disbelief, like I was speaking a different language. He brushed off the idea, saying that most of her trips were international, and Mia wasn't the type to have an affair. That's when I knew for sure he was in serious trouble. I kept quiet after that, realizing I was close to saying too much. Instead of offering more advice, I just sat there, listening to him vent and nodding along with what he wanted to hear. From my perspective, Mia was either already having an affair or plotting her exit from the marriage. Mike was one of the smartest people I knew, but in this case, he was completely oblivious to the situation unraveling around him. He couldn't see that the rug was about to be pulled out from under him. I was grateful we had this conversation because it gave me the chance to prepare myself for what was coming. I didn't know exactly how things would play out, but I knew I needed an exit strategy. There was no way I'd make the same kind of money elsewhere, and the only way to secure my future was to replicate Mike's business model and branch out on my own. I had learned enough and gained plenty of experience to make it work. I had already noticed signs that Mia was positioning herself to take over the company. She had been hiring people loyal to her, mainly employees from China, and most of them reported directly to her, even though they technically worked under me. The work environment had become toxic, and I didn't trust my team anymore. Every move I made was being monitored and reported back to her. After my conversation with Mike at the bar, I saw that he was starting to lose motivation. He wasn't handling his responsibilities the way he used to, though the good news was that the business model was so solid it could run on autopilot. We had enough steady clients to stay profitable, but there was no growth happening, and new product development had stalled. A few days later, I noticed that Mia wasn't coming into the office as regularly, and she wasn't answering her phone, even when I tried calling her on WhatsApp. Our suppliers overseas also started going silent, and we lost a few customers. It was obvious something big was happening. After 5 days of Mia's absence, Mike called me and the other 2 managers into his office. He told us that he and Mia had a falling out, and she was actively trying to sabotage the business. Many of our suppliers and clients were loyal to her, and she was working behind the scenes to start her own company and tarnish our reputation. He warned us that the impact could be severe and that we might have to lay off a significant portion of our staff. Mike asked me to travel to China and Vietnam the following week to secure new suppliers, while he focused on handling the client relationships. Once the other managers left, Mike and I had a private conversation. He admitted I had been right all along. After our talk at the bar, he couldn't shake the thought that Mia might be unfaithful, so he installed monitoring software on her phone. What he found shocked him. Mia had been involved with multiple men through WeChat. One of them had already proposed to her, and she had accepted. They were planning to start a business similar to ours and move in together. Her plan was to marry him and bring him to the States now that she had gained citizenship, thanks to Mike. The guy was an engineer, like Mike, but older and with a much larger network in China. According to the messages Mike had recovered, Mia had known this man long before she even met Mike. Her plan was to divorce Mike and take control of the company. I wasn't sure how she intended to pull that off, but that's what Mike told me. She had been planning to file for divorce in about 5 months, but Mike discovered her plot too soon, forcing her to act prematurely. Mike confronted her, and that's when she stopped coming to work. Most of her business trips had been romantic getaways with this other guy. Before he found out about the affair, Mia had even promised to go to marriage counseling and encouraged Mike to seek individual therapy, all while secretly plotting her escape. Mike admitted that he had fallen into a deep depression and had been contemplating suicide over the past few days. At that point, he started crying, and I hugged him, trying to comfort him. It was clear he had been bottling up his pain for a long time. I asked about his daughter and whether Mia's parents were still living with him. He said that the in-laws had left, and he had hired a babysitter to help care for his daughter. As for Mia, she had gone missing after their confrontation. Mike told me he had tried calling her several times, but she wasn't answering. He had no idea where she was. Mike knew that Mia had been calling his suppliers and clients, telling them to cut ties with his company and sharing confidential documents to damage his reputation. Luckily, some of his customers were loyal enough, or suspected it was a scam, and decided to contact him first to inform him of what was happening. Other suppliers were primarily motivated by money, so as long as they were being paid, they weren't about to sever ties. Mia's plan didn't play out the way she had hoped. At this point, I was starting to think that Mia had left her husband and daughter to join her new fiancé in China. It seemed like she was trying to steal some of Mike's business by convincing his customers and suppliers to cut ties, though she wasn't as successful as she had planned. She had already sabotaged a few of his suppliers in China and Vietnam, so it was only a matter of time before we started running low on critical parts. I had been to China and Vietnam many times, and I had built a reliable network of contacts, so I knew my way around. Although I had also tried sourcing suppliers in South America, I hadn't had much luck. With only about a month's supply of certain key components left, Mike and I booked a one-way trip to China. We had no idea how long we'd need to stay, at least not until we found alternative suppliers for the parts Mia had sabotaged. My focus wasn't on why Mia would want to destroy the business she had helped build, because I had suspected all along that she was trying to silence Mike and take over. The problem was that Mike had been too blind to see it until it was almost too late. Now, we were scrambling to clean up the mess. Back then, I couldn't make sense of Mia's actions. It seemed like it would have been easier for her to just take control of the business instead of trying to start a new one with someone else. Even if the guy she was with was more successful, her plan seemed rushed and poorly thought out, and I was certain it was going to fail. Maybe there was more to the story than I knew, but from where I was standing, that's how it looked. My priority was saving the company, not just for Mike, but for myself. I had a mortgage to pay and a lifestyle to maintain for my wife and kids. Mia was the enemy in my mind, and I didn't care about the livelihoods of the 30-some employees who depended on the business. I was thinking only about myself. Mike and I spent 2 weeks in East Asia, traveling through 3 different countries. By the end of the trip, we managed to recover some of our previous suppliers, mainly because Mia had mysteriously stopped contacting them. As long as we were offering to pay, they were willing to work with us. It was strange that Mia suddenly halted her efforts to ruin the company, but I wasn't about to question it. Whatever the reason, it worked out in our favor. When we got back to the US, it took about a month for things to stabilize, but we eventually weathered the storm. Mia was out of the picture, and we never heard from her again. During those months, I noticed that Mike was never quite the same. He had always been introverted, but now he was more withdrawn, paranoid, and defensive. One time, I asked if he had heard anything about Mia, and he told me that she had abandoned him and their daughter, and he hadn't heard from her since. He seemed suspicious when I asked, like he didn't trust my curiosity, which felt strange after everything we had been through. A few weeks later, one of our employees told me that a missing person report had been filed for Mia. Her family claimed they hadn't heard from her in weeks and had no idea where she was. I immediately called Mike, and he confirmed it was true. He said the police had been investigating and suspected foul play. There was no evidence she had returned to China, and Mike had been the last person to see her, making him the prime suspect. Mike confessed that he hadn't told the police about Mia's affair because he was worried it would give them a motive to arrest him. He also asked me to keep quiet about it. At the time, I didn't suspect Mike had anything to do with her disappearance, and even if I had, I wasn't about to turn him in. I was more concerned with keeping the business afloat. As far as I was concerned, it was better for Mia to stay missing than for this situation to ruin my career and livelihood. 3 months after she was reported missing, I noticed a change in Mike. He became more outgoing, calling me more often and suggesting we hang out. The business had started to bounce back, and I had made a few more trips to East Asia. I convinced Mike to come out with me more often, whether it was to spend time with my family or go out with my old military buddies to help him loosen up and meet new people. I made a point not to bring up Mia. She was old news as far as I was concerned. One night while we were out, Mike mentioned that Mia's parents, along with her wealthy uncle, had been putting pressure on the police to arrest him. They were convinced he had something to do with her disappearance, but there was no solid evidence. Mike had voluntarily allowed the police to search his home, and they found nothing suspicious. He had been upfront about everything, except for the affair. From an outsider's perspective, there hadn't been any signs of serious marital trouble, and neither Mike nor Mia had contacted a divorce lawyer before she vanished. To make things even stranger, the police discovered that Mia had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Mike without his knowledge. That only added to the mystery, and I imagine the police were just as confused as we were. There was no clear motive for Mike to be involved in her disappearance, at least none that the police could pin on him. The police had also questioned the other 2 managers at the company, probably hoping for more insight into Mia's disappearance. I know because they spoke to me as well, but it was clear they were just fishing for clues. None of us volunteered any information, especially about the affair, so they didn't have much to go on. Mia had been doing everything she could to destroy the company, even trying to convince some of the employees to leave and join her. If enough people had left, it would have given the authorities a stronger reason to arrest Mike or build a case against him, if they hadn't already. The investigation seemed to go cold for about 5 months until Mia's family in China hired a private investigator. They began looking into the case and asking around, managing to get some of the Chinese employees to open up about how Mia had tried to persuade them to quit and follow her. A few of Mia's friends also mentioned that she had been unhappy in her marriage and had talked about wanting to leave Mike. The investigators gathered enough evidence to catch the attention of a local news outlet, likely funded by her family. For a while, there were constant stories about Mia in the media, all aimed at putting pressure on the police and district attorney to take action. Eventually, the police picked up some of the private investigators' findings, which included details of Mia's trips, purchases, interviews, and her relationships with other men. At that point, some employees were called into the police station for questioning, and the pressure to talk increased. They soon learned that Mike had told me and the other managers that Mia was actively trying to destroy the business. He had sent me to China to repair the damage she'd done. When the police brought me in for questioning, I came with a lawyer and refused to give them anything that could incriminate me. They wanted a statement from me, knowing I was close to both Mike and Mia. They even tried to intimidate me, implying that I was guilty because I had lawyered up. Deep down, I started to wonder if Mike had done something to Mia, but I didn't want to believe it. After a while, they gave up on trying to get information from me, but they didn't stop harassing me. They'd arrest me, hold me for a day, and release me without charges, only to show up at my office again later. Somehow, they got a warrant to search Mike's house once more and took a few items from it. Flyers with Mia's face were plastered all over town, and the assumption was that she was dead. The posters were asking for tips or information leading to an arrest, with a reward attached. The police investigation dragged on for another 6 months. It was pure torture. The media wouldn't leave us alone, constantly showing up at our workplace, trying to get a statement. I was convinced some of the reporters were being paid off by Mia's family to keep the pressure on. It started to wear down our employees, and we lost a few people because of it. Business began to slow down as a result. During those 6 months, Mike and I stayed in regular contact, and we hung out often. There was this unspoken understanding between us that I knew he might have had something to do with Mia's disappearance, but I never asked. Whatever happened between them, I justified it in my mind by reminding myself that Mia had tried to destroy the company, a business I had poured everything into. She was a threat to my livelihood and my family's future. In my head, she got what was coming to her. After 6 months, the district attorney decided not to move forward with a trial. The case was built on circumstantial evidence and hearsay, and while they might have been able to push it through to a grand jury, a trial could lead to an acquittal if new evidence came out. They opted to wait for something more concrete, and the case was officially moved to the cold case unit. With things calming down, business slowly returned to normal. About a year later, as I was preparing to board a flight, my wife called me. She told me to check the local news. I reminded her that I was at the airport, where only CNN was playing, and asked her to just tell me what was going on. She explained that a jogger had discovered human remains a couple of weeks prior. Animals had likely uncovered the remains, and dental records confirmed they belonged to Mia. I immediately abandoned my flight and called Mike, but he wasn't answering. His lawyer called me shortly after to tell me that Mike had been arrested, and his bail was set at $300,000. We paid it as soon as the judge allowed, and Mike was released. When I finally spoke to Mike, he told me it had all been a terrible accident. According to him, Mia had told him she was leaving him and planned to take their daughter to China. Mike refused, and in the heat of the moment, he pushed her. She hit her head on the wall and collapsed. Mike said she seemed dazed but conscious, so he helped her to the couch. She continued talking, telling him again that she would leave and take their daughter, but her voice was quieter. She lay on the couch to recover from what Mike thought was a mild concussion. He even brought her a blanket when she refused to go to the bedroom. Mike had considered taking her to the hospital but feared the police would get involved, so he decided to wait until morning. But when he went to check on her the next day, she was gone. She had been bleeding from the back of her head, and it was too late to do anything. The coroner's report later showed a small fracture on her skull caused by blunt force trauma, but it was unclear if the injury alone could have caused her death. She may have bled out during the night. When the case went to trial, Mike was convicted of second-degree manslaughter. The jury recommended a sentence of over 20 years in prison. As I write this, Mike has served about 3 months of his sentence, and I'm working on helping him appeal the case. In the meantime, Mike has signed over most of the business to me, and I've promised to take care of him financially while he's in prison. After everything that happened, things took a dark and unexpected turn, uncovering a web of lies, deception, and cutting-edge forensic discoveries that would change our lives forever. In October 2019, Mia, a young mother and wife, disappeared without a trace. The day after she went missing, Mike reported her disappearance, but under suspicious circumstances. Instead of calling 911, he contacted the non-emergency line, immediately raising suspicions among the authorities. Mike suggested that Mia had possibly run off with another man, citing an emotional affair with someone in China. But Mike's odd behavior, along with evidence of a rocky marriage, quickly shifted the focus onto him. Investigators found hours of recorded arguments on their phones, exposing just how troubled their relationship had become. Making things worse, Mike's calm, almost indifferent demeanor during police interviews, where he spoke of casually taking drives instead of actively searching for his wife, further deepened suspicions. By October 25, 2019, Mike's situation worsened when he was arrested for physically abusing their young daughter. Bruises had been found on the child, and this arrest allowed the police to detain Mike while they gathered more evidence. Among the disturbing finds was a script Mike had written, seemingly to mislead investigators. The big break in the case didn't come until March 2021, when a hiker discovered skeletal remains in Rockbridge Memorial State Park, the very spot where Mike had proposed to Mia. This discovery became a turning point in the investigation. Among the evidence collected was a pair of Mike's boots with mud on the soles that contained juniper tree needles. The breakthrough came when forensic scientists, led by Christine Edwards at the Missouri Botanical Garden, performed DNA tests on the needles. They matched them to juniper trees at the burial site. This innovative use of plant DNA placed Mike at the scene, providing critical evidence linking him to Mia's burial site. Mike's trial began in November 2021, and the evidence stacked against him was overwhelming. His defense argued that Mia's death was an accident, that he had pushed her during an argument, causing her to fall and fatally injure herself. But the prosecution, led by Boone County Prosecutor Dan Knight, had a much stronger case. They presented secret audio recordings of Mike and Mia's arguments, along with the forensic botanical evidence. The recordings painted a clear picture of Mike's controlling and abusive behavior, which helped establish a motive for murder. On November 11, 2021, after a 10-day trial, the jury found Mike guilty of second-degree murder. While they didn't believe the killing was premeditated to the degree required for first degree, they still held Mike responsible for Mia's death. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison, 1 year for each year of Mia's life. Following the trial, Mia's friends and family remembered her as a kind, intelligent, and creative woman who had touched many lives. Her untimely death left a significant void, and the tragedy extended to the couple's young daughter, who would now grow up without either parent. The case attracted national attention, not just for the emotional weight of the tragedy, but also for the groundbreaking forensic work involved. The use of plant DNA to link Mike to the crime scene was unprecedented and showcased how innovative techniques can be used to solve complex cases. It served as a reminder of the hidden violence that can exist in seemingly ordinary lives and highlighted the vital role advanced forensic science plays in delivering justice. As Mike serves his sentence, the echoes of this tragedy continue to ripple through the lives of those who knew Mia, ensuring her memory endures. The lessons from this case, especially the importance of forensic innovation, will not be forgotten. For more detailed information on the case, refer to the full stories covered by CBS News and various local Missouri outlets that followed the investigation and trial closely.